HOA fined black man for hunting, so he bought the land they use for hiking and closed it permanently. Jason Montgomery lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled on the edge of a sprawling piece of land that had long been open to the public. The land was a peaceful haven, stretching out with tall trees, winding trails, and rich wildlife. It was a place where locals could hike, explore nature, and for some, like Jason, enjoy a favorite outdoor hobby: hunting. Jason had grown up with a deep love for the outdoors. His father had taught him the ways of the wilderness, including hunting. They would spend weekends walking the land, tracking animals, and finding a sense of peace in the quiet that only the forest could offer. Over the years, Jason had continued this tradition. Every weekend, rain or shine, he would pack his gear and walk the same familiar trails, hunting small game. The land was large, so there was plenty of space for everyone to enjoy it in their own way. But that peaceful routine was about to be shattered. One chilly autumn morning, Jason came home to a letter in his mailbox. It was from the Homeowners Association, or HOA, the group that managed the local community's affairs. Jason had dealt with the HOA in the past, usually for small things like paying fees or attending meetings, but this letter was different. He sat down to read it, frowning as his eyes scanned the words on the page. The HOA was accusing him of breaking their rules. The letter stated that Jason had been hunting on the land without proper approval. According to the HOA, hunting was dangerous and disruptive to other residents, particularly the hikers who frequented the trails. The letter went on to explain that Jason was being fined for his actions, and if he didn't stop hunting, the fines would continue to increase. Jason sat back in his chair, stunned. He had always followed the rules when hunting, ensuring that he was respectful of other people. He only hunted small game, and he always made sure not to disturb the hikers who used the trails. In fact, he had even made sure to stay out of their way. The weeks that followed Jason's purchase of the land were filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt an immense sense of accomplishment. He had taken control of his future, and no one, not even the HOA, could take that away. The months following Jason's bold decision to close the land to the public were filled with tension, but also with a surprising sense of satisfaction. Jason had expected the community to be divided, but what he hadn't expected was the way some people would rally behind him. As the story spread, Jason found himself becoming a symbol of resistance, not just in his neighborhood but in surrounding areas as well. The HOA continued to push for Jason to reopen the land. They held meeting after meeting, writing letters, and even considering legal action. But Jason stood firm. Every time they made a move, he countered with legal support of his own, backed by his lawyer's advice and his own research. He had learned that the HOA, despite its authority, had limits. And Jason wasn't about to let them push him around anymore. One afternoon, while Jason was walking his land, taking in the fresh air and the quiet that only the woods could provide, he noticed a group of people at the edge of his property. They were standing by the "No Trespassing" sign, talking in low voices. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He recognized one of them. It was Alan, the hiker who had spoken to him during that tense moment right after he had put up the sign. Alan had always been a friendly face, someone who genuinely enjoyed the outdoors. Jason didn't want to cause any more bad blood, so he walked toward the group. "Alan," Jason called out, and the group turned to face him. Alan looked surprised but gave a small nod. "Jason," he replied, his tone soft but serious. "We need to talk." Jason wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this was coming. The community had been divided since the moment he made his decision, and it seemed that some people were still not ready to accept it. "Look, I know people are upset," Jason began. "But I have every right to do what I've done. The land is mine now, and I'm not going to open it back up just because the HOA wants me to." Alan shook his head. "It's not just about the HOA. It's about the community, Jason. People used to come here every weekend. They walked the trails, enjoyed the beauty of the land, and it was something that brought us all together. Jason understood. He had spent many hours walking those same trails himself. He knew what the land meant to people, especially those who had no other place to go for a bit of peace. But his decision was still the same. He had purchased the land, and now it was his. No one could take that away. I get that it was a shared space, Jason said. But it was always open to the public because the land wasn't owned by anyone. Now it is. This is my choice, and I have to stand by it. Alan, though clearly upset, nodded slowly. I get it. I really do. But it doesn't make it any easier for the people who used to come here. It was more than just land, it was a part of our lives. And now it's gone. Jason looked at the group. Some of them were older, some younger. There were hikers, families, and even a few elderly people who had walked the trails for years. Jason could see their disappointment in their eyes, and it stung. He hadn't intended for it to feel like a loss to so many people, but he couldn't deny the reality of what he had done. Look, Alan said after a long pause, there's got to be a middle ground. Can't you just consider letting some people through? Just for the weekends? A compromise. Not everyone wants to trespass. They just want a place to walk and think. Jason thought about Alan's words. A compromise. It was something he hadn't considered. He had been so focused on standing firm against the HOA that he hadn't taken into account the effect his actions had on the people around him. He wasn't someone who liked to see people upset, especially not over something that could have been avoided. I don't know, Jason replied. I mean, I've been clear. I've made my choice. But maybe there's a way we can make this work for everyone. Alan's face brightened a little, but he remained cautious. Maybe we could have a system, Jason. People could ask for permission before coming onto the land. It wouldn't be open all the time, but it would give some of the regulars a chance to walk the trails without causing you trouble. Jason felt the weight of the decision he had made. He had never been one to back down, but he also didn't want to be remembered as someone who took something away from the community. Alan's suggestion was reasonable, and for the first time since he had bought the land, Jason began to see a possible path forward that could be fair to both sides. I'll think about it, Jason said slowly. But I can't make any promises. The group seemed to relax a little. They didn't expect an immediate solution, but they appreciated that Jason was willing to consider their point of view. Alan nodded and started to walk back to the edge of the property, but not before turning around one last time. Thanks, Jason. That's all we wanted. Just a chance to talk. Jason watched them walk away. He knew this wasn't going to end overnight. The HOA would still be after him, and there were plenty of residents who wouldn't agree with any compromise. But for the first time in a long while, Jason felt like he might be able to find a solution that wouldn't leave him fighting the community at every turn. The next day, Jason sat down with his lawyer to discuss the situation further. They talked about the legalities of granting access to the land while still maintaining his rights as the owner. His lawyer pointed out that it would be difficult to control who came and went, but there might be a way to set up a system where people could request permission to access the land during certain times. It wouldn't be open to everyone, but it would allow some to use it without Jason being at odds with the HOA or the community. As the weeks went by, Jason worked on a proposal. He sent letters to the HOA and the neighbors who had expressed interest in a compromise. He outlined a system where people could sign up for permission to walk the trails, and the land would remain closed to the public outside of those hours. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The HOA responded quickly, though not as positively as Jason had hoped. They demanded that the land be reopened entirely, calling Jason's offer insufficient and unacceptable. But Jason, despite the pressure, stood his ground. He knew that he couldn't let the HOA win, not this time. The land was his, and he had the right to decide what happened to it. The months that followed were filled with more meetings and discussions. Jason's proposal was considered, but it was met with resistance. It seemed that no matter what Jason did, the HOA and some residents would never be satisfied. But Jason wasn't backing down. He had made a promise to himself, and he intended to keep it. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or if you'd like to continue to the next part. As the months passed, Jason's life began to settle into a new routine. The legal battle with the HOA continued, but he no longer felt the same anxiety that he once had. It wasn't that the situation was resolved, it was far from that. But Jason had learned to navigate the tension with a calm resolve. He knew that what he was doing was right, even if the community didn't agree. Jason had, after all, made a stand for his personal rights. He had fought back when the HOA tried to bully him into compliance, and he wasn't about to let their demands define his future. As hard as it had been to close the land to the public, the act had forced him to reflect on his relationship with the community. He realized that owning land wasn't just about property rights, it was about understanding the impact his choices had on others. And so, after much contemplation, Jason decided to go ahead with the compromise proposal he had been considering. He would allow some access to the land, but under his terms. He would create a system where people could request permission to walk the trails during certain hours of the day. The land would still be closed to the public at other times, and Jason would have control over who used it and when. It wasn't perfect, but it was a middle ground, one that could bring a sense of peace to the community without compromising his rights as the land's owner. He crafted a letter, carefully outlining his plan, and sent it to the HOA, along with a few of his neighbors who had expressed their interest in seeing the land reopened for public use. He wanted them to know that he wasn't a man who took joy in denying others the chance to enjoy nature, but he had to be firm in his decision. The land was his, and he would be the one to decide its future. To his surprise, the response from the HOA was different this time. They didn't reject the proposal outright, but instead, they asked for further clarification on how it would work. Jason knew that this was a small victory. The HOA had been resistant from the beginning, but now they were willing to listen. It was a sign that they were finally starting to recognize that Jason wasn't just some angry man trying to make a point, he was a responsible property owner who was trying to find a fair solution to a complicated issue. The following weeks were spent working out the details of the proposal. Jason worked with his lawyer to set clear guidelines for the request system, ensuring that the land's access would remain controlled and that no one would be able to use it without permission. He set up an online platform where residents could sign up for specific time slots, and he established a set of rules that would govern how the land could be used. No hunting would be allowed during public access times, and Jason would be the final authority on any disputes or issues that arose. It was a fair compromise, one that respected both his rights as the landowner and the desires of the community. When the system was finally in place, Jason sent out the official announcement. The response from the community was mixed, but the majority of people seemed relieved. The hikers who had fought against Jason's decision began to soften their stance. They appreciated the opportunity to use the land again, even if it wasn't as freely available as it once had been. Jason had shown them that he wasn't unwilling to listen, that he understood the importance of the land to the community. And in return, they had shown him that they were willing to accept his terms, as long as they could still enjoy the natural beauty of the area. But not everyone was happy with the compromise. Some residents still believed that Jason had no right to close the land off in the first place, and they resented the restrictions he had placed on it. The HOA, too, was unhappy with the new arrangement. They didn't want to acknowledge that Jason had found a solution that worked for both sides. They had hoped that he would give in and open the land up entirely. They had hoped that their power over him would win out. But Jason had proven them wrong. Jason didn't mind the criticism. He had learned to expect it. It came with the territory of making a difficult decision. But he had done what he believed was right, and he was content with the choice he had made. He had stood up for his rights as a property owner, and in the end, he had found a way to make it work for everyone involved. As the days passed and the seasons changed, the land began to feel different. The trees grew taller, the trails more worn. Jason found himself spending more time there, enjoying the peace that came with knowing the land was his to protect. There were still moments when he would encounter hikers, people who had signed up for permission to use the land. But the interactions were different now. They weren't confrontational. They were respectful. People had come to understand that Jason wasn't someone who took pleasure in denying them access to the land. He had just needed to find a way to protect what was his. Jason spent a lot of time walking the trails, sometimes with his dog, sometimes alone. He found solace in the familiar paths, in the quiet rustle of the leaves and the sound of the birds overhead. This was his sanctuary. And while it was no longer the shared space it once had been, Jason had come to realize that it didn't have to be. He had created a new kind of balance. The land, now controlled by Jason, was no longer a point of conflict. It had become a symbol of his ability to stand up for himself and make a tough decision. It was a place where he could go to think, to reflect, and to remember that even in the face of resistance, sometimes the right choice wasn't the easiest one. In the end, Jason knew that life would go on, whether or not people understood his actions. He had made his decision for himself, and it had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had made him more aware of his rights, more willing to fight for them, and more determined to live life on his own terms. The land that he had purchased, once a source of division and frustration, had become a symbol of personal strength and perseverance. Jason had taken control of his destiny, and in doing so, he had shown the community that sometimes, standing firm in the face of opposition is the only way to truly protect what matters most. And as the sun set over the land, Jason knew that his fight had been worth it. He had found peace, not just him. On the other hand, he knew that his decision to close the land to hikers would create tension in the community. Jason had always been a peaceful man, and the idea of causing such an uproar wasn't something he took lightly. But he was firm in his belief that he had done the right thing. Jason watched from his porch as the news spread. The first reaction was shock. Many people had no idea he was even interested in buying the land, let alone taking such drastic action. The hikers were the first to show their outrage. Groups of them stood at the edge of the property, staring at the no trespassing sign that Jason had put up. Some tried to argue with him, pleading for him to reconsider. Others stood silently, their disappointment clear. One morning, as Jason made his way to the property to check on things, he saw a small group of hikers gathered near the entrance. They were speaking in hushed tones, clearly frustrated. Jason approached them calmly, knowing this would be the first time he would directly face the people affected by his decision. "Jason, this isn't fair," one of the hikers, a man named Alan, said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and sadness. "We've been walking these trails for years. It's the only place nearby where we can enjoy nature. You can't just take it away from us." Jason understood Alan's frustration. He had spent many hours hiking the land himself, enjoying the peace and quiet. But this was his land now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. "I'm not taking anything away," Jason replied calmly. "This is my property, and I have every right to decide what happens here. The land is still there, it's just closed to the public now. If you want to walk on it, you'll have to ask permission first." The hikers were taken aback by his response. They hadn't expected Jason to be so firm. They had hoped he might change his mind, but Jason was resolute. "This isn't right," Alan said, shaking his head. "People have been walking these trails for years. It's a part of the community now. You can't just lock it up." Jason didn't respond immediately. He knew that there was no easy way to explain his decision. For some people, the idea of private property was foreign. They believed that land like this should belong to everyone. But Jason understood the value of owning something for himself. He had worked hard for what he had, and the land was no different. I understand where you're coming from, Jason finally said. But this is my decision, and I've made it. The HOA gave me no choice, and now I'm taking back what's mine. The hikers didn't argue further, but Jason could see the disappointment in their eyes. He knew they weren't going to give up easily. He had expected as much. But he wasn't going to change his mind. As the days went by, the tension in the community grew. Jason's decision to close the land had created a ripple effect. Some people supported him, believing that he had every right to do what he had done. Others, however, were less understanding. The HOA, of course, was furious. They had never anticipated that Jason would take such a drastic step. They had thought the fines would force him to back down, that he would give in to their demands. But Jason wasn't the type to give up easily. The HOA called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Jason received an invitation to attend, though he wasn't sure what the outcome would be. He knew the HOA was determined to find a way to reverse his decision. But Jason was ready for them. He wasn't afraid of their threats or their legal maneuvering. He had done his homework, and he knew his rights. The meeting was tense from the moment Jason entered the room. The HOA board members were seated at the front, looking as if they had been expecting a fight. Jason could feel the eyes of the other residents in the room on him. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Montgomery, the HOA president, Mrs. Martin, began, her voice stern, "You've caused a great deal of disruption in this community. The land you've purchased has been a public space for years. And now you've decided to close it off, causing problems for our residents. We demand that you reopen the land immediately." Jason stood up and addressed the room. He had prepared for this moment. He had anticipated their arguments and their demands. "I understand that people are upset. But this is my land now, and I have every right to decide what happens to it. The HOA overstepped its boundaries when it tried to impose rules on me. I'm simply standing up for myself." Mrs. Martin's face reddened, and the other board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jason. "You can't just lock up the land and expect people to be okay with it," she insisted. "This community is about shared spaces, about being able to enjoy the outdoors together. You're destroying that." Jason knew she was right about one thing: the land had been a shared space. It had been a place where people from all walks of life could come together and enjoy the beauty of nature. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had earned his right to the land, and he wasn't about to give it up just because the HOA didn't like his decision. "I'm not destroying anything," Jason replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm simply exercising my right to own property and make decisions about it. If people want to use the land, they can ask me for permission. It's still here, it's still beautiful, and it's still open to those who respect my decision." The room was silent for a moment as the board members processed his words. Jason could tell that they weren't prepared for his defiance. They had expected him to back down, to apologize and reopen the land. But Jason wasn't apologizing for anything. He had made his decision, and he was ready to stand by it. After a long pause, Mrs. Martin spoke again, her voice softer now. "You're making a mistake, Jason. The community will never forgive you for this. We won't let it go." Jason didn't flinch. "I'm not worried about what the community thinks. I'm worried about what's right. And what's right is that I own this land, and I have the right to decide who uses it." The tension in the room was palpable, but Jason didn't let it sway him. He had made his decision, and no amount of pressure from the HOA would make him change his mind. As the meeting ended, Jason walked out of the room with his head held high. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. The HOA wouldn't give up easily, and the community was divided. But he was ready for whatever came next. Jason Montgomery had made a statement. And he was prepared to stand firm for as long as it took. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or if you want to proceed to the next part, ding the busiest times on the weekends. But now, the HOA was telling him that his hobby was unacceptable. Jason wasn't sure what bothered him more, the fact that the HOA had decided to take action without ever speaking to him first, or the unfairness of being singled out. He had heard nothing but good things from his neighbors over the years, and now this. Why was he the one being punished? Determined to resolve the issue, Jason decided to attend the next HOA meeting. He hoped that speaking directly with the board would clear up the misunderstanding. The meeting was held in a small room at the community center, and when Jason arrived, he could feel the tension in the air. The HOA board members were sitting at a long table, and a small crowd of residents had gathered to listen to the discussions. Jason stood up and made his way to the front, where he addressed the board. "I've been hunting on that land for years. I've always made sure to follow the rules, and I've never caused any trouble. But now, I'm being fined, and I don't understand why." The HOA president, a woman named Mrs. Martin, looked at him coldly. "Mr. Montgomery, we've had numerous complaints from residents, particularly hikers, who feel unsafe when they're on the trails. They've expressed concerns about hunters being on the same land." Jason was shocked. He hadn't heard anything about these complaints. "I always stay out of their way. I've never seen anyone complain to me directly." "We've had enough concerns to take action," Mrs. Martin replied firmly. "The safety of our residents comes first. You need to stop hunting on the land immediately, or the fines will continue to increase." Jason felt his blood pressure rising. The decision had already been made. There was no room for discussion, no opportunity to explain his side fully. He was being punished for something that, in his mind, wasn't even a problem. "I've been respectful of the land, and I've always made sure not to disturb anyone," Jason insisted. "Why not work with me instead of fining me? I've been part of this community for years." But the board wasn't interested in hearing his perspective. The conversation became more heated, and Jason could feel the frustration building inside him. He was being painted as a villain when all he had done was enjoy a tradition passed down from his family. When the meeting ended, Jason walked out, his head full of anger and confusion. He couldn't understand why the HOA was treating him this way. It felt like a personal attack, and he was furious. But he also knew that the situation wasn't going to go away on its own. He had to make a choice: either give in to the HOA's demands or fight back. Jason's first instinct was to let it go. Maybe he could find a new place to hunt, one that wouldn't cause trouble. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how unfair it was. He wasn't breaking any laws. The land had been open to everyone, and now he was being told that he couldn't enjoy it the way he always had. He decided to reach out to his neighbors. Surely, they could see how ridiculous the HOA's actions were. Jason started talking to the people in his neighborhood, hoping they would back him up. Some agreed with him. They felt that the HOA had no right to impose such restrictions on him. Others, however, sided with the hikers. They said that the land should be a peaceful place for everyone, and that Jason's hunting was putting others at risk. The more Jason spoke to his neighbors, the more he realized that the issue wasn't just about hunting, it was about control. The HOA seemed to think they could dictate how everyone used the land. And it wasn't just Jason who was being affected, it was everyone who lived in the community. As the days passed, Jason's frustration grew. The fines kept coming in, and he knew that the HOA wasn't going to stop until he gave in. He started to feel trapped, like his rights as a homeowner didn't matter. He was being pushed out of his own neighborhood, and the worst part was, no one seemed to care. But Jason wasn't the type to back down easily. He had spent years working hard to build a life he was proud of, and he wasn't going to let some board members take away something he loved. He was going to fight for his right to enjoy the land, and he was going to make sure that the HOA understood just how serious he was. In the back of his mind, Jason knew that this wasn't going to be a simple battle. The HOA was powerful, and it would take more than just a few words to change their minds. But one thing was certain, Jason wasn't going to let them get away with it. He would find a way to take control of the situation, no matter what it took. Let me know if you need any adjustments or further expansions. Jason woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. The night had been long, filled with thoughts of what had happened at the HOA meeting. He couldn't shake the feeling of being unjustly treated. The HOA's decision to fine him had left him feeling powerless. All he had wanted to do was enjoy his weekends in peace, the same way he had for years. But now, everything had changed. As he sipped his coffee, Jason thought about the conversation he'd had with his neighbors after the meeting. Some had supported him, telling him that the HOA had overstepped its bounds. They agreed that his hunting didn't pose a danger to anyone. But others, especially the hikers, seemed to believe that his presence on the land was a threat to their safety. They didn't understand that Jason wasn't some reckless hunter. He was a responsible outdoorsman who followed the rules and had always respected the land. It seemed that the community was divided. Some people saw the land as a shared space, one where everyone could enjoy nature in their own way. But others thought it should be reserved solely for those who wanted to hike and enjoy the outdoors without the risk of encountering a hunter. Jason didn't understand why they couldn't share the space, why there had to be a conflict between the two groups. Jason's frustration grew each day. The fines kept coming, and with each letter, the anger inside him burned hotter. The HOA had taken a stance against him, but he couldn't let it go. He wasn't just going to sit back and let them push him around. This was his home, and he had every right to enjoy it the way he saw fit. The more Jason thought about it, the more he realized how unfair it was. The HOA had decided to impose their rules on him without ever consulting him. They hadn't even given him a chance to explain his side of the story. The meeting had been a blur of accusations and misunderstandings. But Jason knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let them win. He had always been a man who valued his independence, and the idea that someone, especially a group of people he didn't even know well, could tell him how to live his life was unbearable. He'd worked hard to build the life he had, and now he was being told he couldn't even hunt on land that had always been open to the public. It felt like a personal attack. Determined to fight back, Jason started looking for ways to challenge the HOA's authority. He spent hours researching property laws, zoning regulations, and homeowners' rights. He learned about the ways in which the HOA could be held accountable for overstepping its boundaries. He even began talking to a lawyer, hoping to find a way to have the fines lifted and the hunting restrictions overturned. But as he dug deeper into the legalities, Jason started to realize that this fight wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had a lot of power. They had the support of the majority of the residents, and they were backed by a legal team that knew how to protect their interests. Jason knew that taking them on would be a battle of wills, one that might last for months, or even years. But he wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. One evening, after another long day of researching, Jason sat on his porch, staring out at the land. The cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and he could hear the distant sound of birds singing. It was his place of peace, his sanctuary, and he refused to let it be taken from him. But Jason also knew that there was another option, one that might give him the control he needed. He had always been interested in real estate, and over the years, he had bought and sold several properties. He wasn't just any businessman. Jason had a knack for seeing potential in land and properties that others overlooked. And as he sat there thinking, an idea began to form in his mind. What if he could buy the land that the HOA was controlling? What if he could take ownership of it himself? It was a bold idea, but Jason liked it. By owning the land, he would have the final say in how it was used. The HOA wouldn't be able to fine him or impose any more restrictions. He could do what he wanted with it, and if others didn't like it, they would have no choice but to respect his decision. The thought of it made Jason's heart race with excitement. He was a man of action, and this was something he could control. He knew that buying the land wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make it happen. He began researching the property's ownership, learning everything he could about the corporation that owned the land and the terms of its lease with the HOA. It didn't take long for Jason to track down the information he needed. The land was owned by a large corporation that had no real attachment to it. It was just another piece of property that they leased out for public use. Jason knew that the corporation would be open to selling it, especially since it wasn't generating much income for them. Over the next few weeks, Jason made contact with the corporation. He explained his interest in buying the land and asked if they would be willing to sell it. The corporation, eager to unload the property, seemed more than willing to discuss a deal. Jason started negotiating, carefully working out the terms of the purchase. It wasn't a quick process, and there were many back and forth discussions, but Jason was persistent. As the negotiations continued, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He was taking control of the situation. The HOA had thought they could intimidate him into giving up, but Jason wasn't the type of person to be pushed around. He was going to show them that he wouldn't back down, no matter what. By the time the deal was finalized, Jason had secured the land. He was now the proud owner of the property that had been the source of so much trouble. As soon as the paperwork was signed, Jason took a deep breath. It was done. He had done it. But Jason wasn't finished yet. He had one more step to take, one that would send a clear message to the HOA and the community. He wasn't just going to keep the land for himself. He was going to make a statement. He walked out to the entrance of the land, where the hiking trails began, and put up a sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." When word got out that Jason had bought the land, the community was shocked. The hikers were outraged. The HOA was furious. The local media even caught wind of the story, and soon Jason was a topic of debate in the community. Some praised him for standing up for his rights, while others condemned him for taking away a beloved public space. Jason didn't care about the opinions of others. He had taken back control of his life and his property. The land was his now, and he wasn't going to let anyone dictate how he used it. Let me know if you need any changes or more detail in the next part.